Recently, since President Trump came to office, he scrapped the USAID, which was funding a lot of mitigation measures in Africa. And now, so many programs are not running, which were to mitigate the impact of climate and the extremities of the weather. So, what do you have to say about that?
I'm sorry. As an American, I certainly did not vote for Donald Trump. I wish he had not been elected. We have 3.5 years more to get through. It's regrettable that he has cut off some of the assistance that is based on justice and fairness and on our common effort to create a brighter future. I wish there were another election tomorrow to vote him out of office, but we have to wait 3.5 years. In the meantime, there is a chance that our subnational leaders, the governors of states, the mayors of cities, the leaders of companies that have integrity, can limit some of the damage Donald Trump appears determined to do. The Congress, we won't have to wait 3.5 years to see a change in the Congress. We have elections for the House of Representatives every 2 years, and for 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years. And 1.5 years from now, we will have those elections. We call them midterm elections, halfway through the term of a president. And I think there's a real chance that we'll see significant improvements in U.S. policy after the midterm elections 1.5 years from now. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States of America became, in the eyes of many, the most powerful nation in the world and the wealthiest nation in the world. There is an old saying that I heard when I was growing up, perhaps you did as well, to whom much is given, much is required. And I think that embodies a principle of justice that the United States should continue to respect. Now, it's been a long time since the end of World War II, and there have been many changes. The Chinese economy has grown quite dramatically. The U.S. Share of global wealth has declined. We are still the most powerful and wealthiest country, however, and I think we should continue to play the kind of global leadership role that we have played for the last 75 years. That is my view. There should have been a more gradual transition, and certainly today, there should be a pathway to make a transition that doesn't hurt and harm so many people who have come to depend on USAID. Maybe over a longer period of time, other nations could find ways to fill that gap, but to do it suddenly is cruel. It's cruel. And I do not support it. And I'm sorry that he has made these decisions.
So, you have helped shape climate global discourse for a long time. We already have 29 COPs, and we are just headed to the 30th COP, yet emissions keep rising, while the climate vulnerable nations are sidelined. So I'll give you an example, which you already know, the recent UAE COP was led by a fossil fuel CEO. Do you still believe in UNFCCC process is still legitimate?
I have quite loudly advocated for serious reforms in the COP process, even before Dubai and Baku, but certainly in Dubai at COP28 and in Baku last year at COP29, I vociferously argued we have to reform this process. It has been, to an unhealthy degree, captured by the fossil fuel polluters. The very fact that the CEO of one of the biggest and dirtiest oil companies on the planet was installed as the head of COP28 is ridiculous and absurd. The fact that the number of fossil fuel company delegates outnumber the combined delegations of the 10 nations that are most harmed by the climate crisis is absurd and unjust. We need reforms in the process. Now, the fossil fuel industry and the petrostates, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, you know the others, they have captured control of the process to a very unhealthy degree. That needs to be changed. I've advocated for specific reforms. We should not require unanimity in order to adopt policies. That's one of the reasons why it took 28 COPs before they could even mention the principal cause of the crisis, fossil fuels. And then in COP28, they finally mentioned fossil fuels, and then in COP29, they got rid of it again. It's frustrating to all of us, I include myself in the community of activists who have been trying to mobilize solutions for this crisis. But yes, I agree that the COP process should be reformed.
So you called climate change a planetary emergency 2 decades ago, yet US continues to subsidize fossil fuel. Has the climate emergency narrative lost meaning because of political inaction?
I think that in order to solve the climate crisis, we're going to have to address the democracy crisis. And we have one in the US. We have one in many countries around the world, where very wealthy and powerful special interests have found ways to use their wealth and influence to capture the minds and hearts of the politicians and the policymakers. And some politicians just are under the thumb of the big polluters. They do whatever they tell them to do. It's disgusting. It needs to be changed. But in order to bring about that change, we have to infuse more integrity into the process of democracy. And that is one of the challenges that I'm spending most of my time on now.
Women are the most affected when it comes to climate change, but more often than not, they're not involved in decision-making processes and in the solutions. From the series that you've been doing as a climate advocate, where do you see the role of women? What do you think is the role of women when it comes to climate change solutions?
I think the evidence supports the view that women are, on average, more affected by the climate crisis than men, perhaps because of their typically larger role in caring for young children. It's not always the case, but on average that is the case. And I think that may be part of it. And of course, in many countries, including my own, there is a history of discrimination against women. The recent progress has been very, very inspiring to people who have paid attention to it, and I think it is changing. But still, women are discriminated against. It's a sign that we still have work to do on eliminating discrimination. I will say, however, that one of the most inspiring and effective leaders I have ever met on climate in my life was the late Wangari Maathai from Kenya. She inspired me. I was privileged to become a close friend. She visited my home in Tennessee in the U.S. Her daughter Wanjira is here today, of course, and continues her mother's tradition of leadership. So I think it very much depends on the individual women involved and the communities involved. But I don't disagree that women still face, on average, a burden of discrimination and should be allowed to play as big a role in shaping climate policy as they wish.
So just this afternoon, I had a group of pastoralists who have gone big on carbon markets. But then they have also accused Western corporations for buying African land for offsets, often displacing these indigenous communities. In Kenya, I can give you an example of the Northern Rangelands Trust, which faces accusation of land grabs under a carbon credit scheme. So how do you respond to this kind of claims that carbon trading is recreating colonial extraction under green facade?
There has been a history of abuses where carbon credits are concerned. And one of the abuses has been a failure to integrate the viewpoints of those in the communities that are affected. If they do not have input, if their experiences and points of view are not involved in shaping a plan for carbon credits, then that's unjust. And climate justice is justice, and we have to pursue it. There is also a second series of source of abuse with carbon credits, and that is there is such an asymmetry, an imbalance between the demand for carbon credits from the wealthy countries of the West and companies that have pledged to reduce their emissions, and they think the easy way to do it would be to buy carbon credits. That demand is very large compared to a much smaller supply of carbon credits that really have integrity, and that not only have integrity but also have full participation from the local communities in the design of those credits. So that history of abuse makes me very skeptical of many carbon credits. Second point I want to make, though, is some people have looked at that history and have come to the conclusion we ought to just eliminate carbon credits completely. I do not share that point of view because I hold out hope that there can be a way to design some carbon credits that are based on full input from the communities affected and do have high integrity and are not just tricky, false solutions. I do think that if they can be designed correctly, there can be a role for carbon credits. Some nations are using hydroelectric power to produce green hydrogen by, not from fossil fuels, but from separating the hydrogen from the oxygen in H2O in the water molecules, and then using that green hydrogen to make pollution-free steel. And some of the investors in those projects can get some carbon credits. And I think that if it's documented thoroughly, and if you can prove the integrity of the project, and if you can demonstrate that no communities are being overlooked and harmed in the process, I think there are examples of where it can work. But there are very few of them, I have to say. I myself have been tempted at times to say, no more carbon credits, they're just not working. But I have seen a few examples where I think they are justified.
But do you think it's justice for a country that is a polluter to buy carbon credits to continue, so that it can continue sort of polluting the environment?
No, I don't. And the biggest problem I have with carbon credits, one of the biggest problems, the fact that local communities are sometimes not consulted and not involved, and they have to suffer the damage. That's just as big a problem. But another big problem is that some of the carbon credits proposed in the past have simply been an excuse to allow the polluters to continue to pollute. And the number one objective has to be to reduce emissions. Look, we're in a global crisis here. This thin shell of atmosphere, we're all trapped inside of it. And we're using it as an open sewer, and it's trapping so much extra heat. It is really doing serious damage to the ecological systems that we depend upon, that our children and grandchildren will depend upon. So if they're using some trickery to pretend that they're reducing emissions and not actually doing it, that's terrible. It ought to be outlawed. It ought to be prevented.
When you look at countries like Uganda discovering oil and running into trouble because of wanting to exploit that, the European Union government, the Parliament also passed some resolutions to try and dissuade Uganda from exploiting its oil, its new discoveries. And the explanation from the Ugandan government is that, it's disingenuous of the West that has developed on the back of coal and fossil fuels to then come and say that Africa cannot exploit that because of the climate crisis, and yet Africa contributes least to the climate crisis. What's your view on that?
Of course, African nations have a right to develop as they choose to develop. But I would urge them to listen to the young people in Africa. In the case of Uganda, to young people like Vanessa Nakate, who have done the research and who have learned the lessons of history. And I would say this, I'll take my own country as an example. If 150 years ago, when we began the rapid economic development, if at that time the cheapest source of electricity was solar electricity, we would have used it. If we had electric vehicles instead of the smog-producing, petrol-burning vehicles, we would have used them. If we had wind and batteries, we would have used that instead of creating all the pollution-based problems and the poverty and the resource curse that has so frequently been associated with the development of fossil fuels. Look at Nigeria, for example. The history of the environment being left poisoned and destroyed, people harmed, their health ruined, driven into poverty, with the wealth from those fossil fuels going not to the people, but to a very small number of wealthy elites, and mostly to those who are extracting from the fossil fuels from Africa and selling it to Europe and Asia and elsewhere. That's why so many call it fossil fuel colonialism. And so I would urge the African leaders who speak about a right to develop fossil fuels to listen to their own young people who have learned the history and who, in my view, are pointing to a better pathway to develop in a clean way. Also, the climate crisis is a global issue, and every nation that takes a look at what the impact is, and it's been very harsh on Kenya, knows that we have to reduce the global warming pollution before it destroys our civilization.
Are you optimistic? Are you making any headway as a promoter of managing climate?
There is an old saying attributed to an economist in the U.S. years ago, Rudy Dornbush. It's known as Dornbush's Law. And that law says this: things take longer, there are two parts to it. Things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen faster than you thought they could. We've seen that in technology. We've seen that sometimes in politics as well. When the struggle to give women the right to vote was underway, there were many who thought, we'll never be able to succeed. But then when the heart of the issue was revealed as a choice between right and wrong, all of a sudden it happened quickly. Abolition of slavery, the same pattern. And I think we're very close to that point where the climate crisis is concerned. I think we are going to win this struggle. I do believe, however, that there is an open question as to whether or not we will win it in time to avoid truly catastrophic consequences. I believe we will, but it depends upon how quickly we can accumulate the sufficient political will to make the policy changes. Stop forcing taxpayers to subsidize the dirtiest source of energy in the world, fossil fuels. Come up with a fair and just way of allocating investment capital around the world so that developing nations can participate fully the way the wealthy countries have. I think that these changes are in the works. I know that advocates are gaining ground. If you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide last year, many people are surprised to learn that 93% of it was solar and wind. That's amazing. If you look at how the cost for pollution-free renewable energy has come down so quickly, it's really amazing. And these positive changes also give me hope. But the most hope, the biggest source of hope for me are the climate activists here in Africa. They are so energetic. They've taken the time to educate themselves, to network with one another, and to learn how to communicate and advocate skillfully. So it reminds me of Wangari Maathai, who I first met 35 years ago here in Nairobi. And I think they are following in her tradition.
But do you believe it's possible to industrialize on clean energy, on renewable energy? Kenya has run into problems with the activists that you're talking about when they try to exploit coal for industrialization. And yet at the same time, you look at Germany going back to it.
I do think that it's definitely possible to industrialize on the basis of clean energy. That is happening all around the world now. The example you cite with Germany is a specialized case that is related to the sadistic invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the sudden cutoff of the methane gas from Russia. But the energy minister of Germany said last year, solar energy is freedom energy. And they are now moving very aggressively toward more renewables. I think there's a temporary move back to a little bit more coal because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.